Hi, everyone, and welcome to 35 Years and Counting, our 5-week program highlighting the 35 years of long-term raptor migration data we've collected across Hawkwatch International's network of migration sites. We're so glad you've joined us for this opportunity to learn and celebrate together. I'm Kirsten Elliott, and I'm the Development and Communications Director here at Hawkwatch International. And tonight we're going to be taking a deep dive into some of the research and conservation that our migration network has made possible. Dr. Steve Slater will explore how long-term monitoring data has inspired further in-depth research and conservation actions to stop the declines of golden eagles. This is going to be a pretty packed presentation, so I encourage you to make use of the Q&A feature or the chat if you have questions, and we'll take as many as we can at the end. But before we get started, I want to thank our sponsors who've made this 5-week celebration possible. Thank you to our presenting sponsor, UAMPS, as well as our other sponsors, Caddis Enterprises, NextEra Energy, Anzac Polish Law, Ruby Mountain, Rocky Mountain Power, Terracon, the Birds and Wine Group, Enyo Renewable Energy, and Tab Bank. As you'll see tonight, there's still much work to be done in raptor conservation. If you appreciate tonight's program and are able, I hope you'll consider making a tax-deductible donation, as they're all being matched dollar for dollar up to $50,000 through November 3rd. You can do that by texting Hawkwatch, all one word, to 56651, or by visiting hawkwatch.org/donate. So thank you again for joining us tonight to celebrate 35 years of raptor research, conservation, and education. Steve, thanks so much for being here tonight. I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you. Let me get my screen share up a moment. Thanks everyone for being here. Just briefly looking through the list of folks attending, and recognize some of your names, and thanks for being here. And as Kirsten mentioned, tonight we're going to dive right into a discussion of the research we've been doing on golden eagles and how that's been informed by initially our migration counts over the last 35 years and where that's taking us into the future. And just to reiterate really quickly, we are celebrating our 35th anniversary. So as Kirsten mentioned, if you can help support us, we'd appreciate that. You can text Hawkwatch to that 56651 and have your donation matched. Just to give you a sense of what we're going to cover tonight, it is going to be a fairly full presentation. I'll try to look at things from about the 30,000 foot level, just to give you an overview of what we've done with golden eagles and where the story has taken us. So this is the flight path, as we'll call it, that we're going to take. I'm just going to briefly give you Hawkwatch's mission if you're not familiar with it and how golden eagles fit into that, and then give you some background on golden eagles themselves, and their ecology and some of the protections they have. And then we'll move right into where Hawkwatch started with migration counts and how that helped inform some concern over golden eagles. And then you'll see how kind of research projects just evolved from there, from nesting studies to a winter road study we've been doing, and so on. And then we'll come back to look at where we are now with what we've learned throughout these studies, and what that's changed as far as protections and our knowledge, and talk a little bit about where we're going right now and the future directions with our research. And we'll finish up with how you can help us do that. So if you're not familiar with our mission, it is to conserve our shared environment through education, long-term monitoring, and scientific research. And we do that using raptors as a model or indicator species of ecosystem health. And I think as you hear me share about golden eagles, hopefully that will become clear to you how raptors do serve that purpose. Just briefly, being aerial predators that feed at the top of the food chain, they cover large landscapes, and so they can sample large landscapes and tell us about the health of our shared environment. Let's see if we can get this to advance. It's frozen for some reason. Okay, here we go. Moving right into the basics of golden eagle ecology. If you don't know much about them, this will just give you a little bit of a background so we can talk about some of the threats and research. They are an open country species. being as large as they are, they can't hunt in forests because of contact with trees and other things. So they require open areas to hunt in, and they require nesting sites that are secure. So they often seek out cliffs or tall trees. They're considered a slow growth strategy species. That means that they have a long lifespan, but fairly low reproduction compared to some other species. They can live 30 to 40 years. They don't reproduce often until their 5th year or so of life, and they may have only 1 or 3 eggs per year, and they skip years depending on how the conditions are in the environment in particular years. In the Western US, jackrabbits, like what you see here, are a primary prey item. In Utah, for example, they represent about 60% of the diet. And they have fairly large territories because of their food requirements, and they defend these territories, and that in combination with their adaptations to open country and nest sites that are relatively secure means that they're naturally at fairly low densities on the landscape. This makes them difficult to study. It's easier to study more common things that we can get our hands on more readily, but other things make it difficult to study them as well, such as some strict protections, which I'll talk about in a moment. They generally prefer remote areas away from people, and they have a general wariness of humans. And then I just have a range map here showing a range map from the 90s, and this a little bit illustrates the evolution of our understanding of eagles. This was a course map outlining some seasonal ranges of golden eagles. And in 2002, an updated map came out in the Birds of North America count for golden eagles. We have some question marks and some open areas where we are not quite sure about what they're doing within these dashed areas. And then more recently from 2020, with some of the information that we'll share tonight that we've gathered over the years, this updated map of their distributions. I want to talk really quickly about the historic eagle protections that existed as Hawkwatch was founded and began their counts 35 years ago, because this really, I think, helps explain why there's so much interest in golden eagles. I think many of you will be familiar with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, or what we call MBTA. That's been around for over 100 years. Interestingly, raptors were added into it in only the 70s. You may have seen in the news that there was a relaxation of enforcement around incidental take of birds recently, which has now been reinstated. Additionally, golden eagles and bald eagles are unique among our raptors in that they are protected under something we call BGEPA, the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. So whereas the MBTA generally will penalize you, or it prohibits shooting or killing, or in other ways outright harassing raptors, the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act even considers disturbance, any type of disturbance, a violation. So it's a much stricter regulation for protection of eagles. So this can be a little bit of a concern if we consider the situation in 1986 when we were just getting started at Hawkwatch, and the status of what we knew about golden eagles. We didn't really have an understanding of what the true population size of golden eagles were. There was an estimate of around 100,000. We didn't know if they were increasing, if they were stable or decreasing. And there's little information on their movement ecology, survival, and so on. And even a number of years later, in 2002, in the Birds of North America count, a number of identified priorities for golden eagles in terms of research was understanding or increasing our monitoring of their populations, understanding the population dynamics, assessing things like contaminants and dispersal from natal areas, and genetic analysis, and so forth. And hopefully you'll hear me talk about a number of these tonight. So setting that background of really not a number of knowledge gaps for golden eagles when Hawkwatch began doing our migration counts, I wanted to jump right into our migration network, which you can see our sites here shown across the Western US. And if you can recall back to that range map, you can see a lot of our migration sites in the West occur within that core distribution of the golden eagle. And we've been counting on these sites for many years, as you can see in the table showing the start date for these sites. Migration sites seem to be pretty well situated for counting things like raptors that are at low densities and hard to detect during the breeding season when they're territorial, because during the fall they will use ridges to migrate in high numbers, and so it gives us an advantage to count them when they're concentrated during this period. When Hawkwatch began migration counts shortly after, a partnership was formed with other hawk counting organizations to form something called the Raptor Population Index, or RPI. And one of the first products of that partnership was this book you can see on the right, The State of North America's Birds of Prey. And that had assessments of species trends from migration counts for the period 1974 to 2005. And within that book, you can find this image here showing arrows indicating declines or increases across our Western sites. And a number of sites showed significant declines, the solid black arrows pointing downward, and 4 other sites showed non-significant declines for golden eagles. So this was one of the first indications that there were some concerns over the populations of golden eagles from these migration counts. We can look at the more complete data now through the present for migration counts. And I just wanted to bring this up here because it does, to me, really illustrate the importance of long-term monitoring, which is often difficult to fund and keep in continuity. But if we had only, for example, looked at the last 15 years on this graph, we could assume that populations are stable for golden eagles because the trend hasn't really changed. But having the longer term perspective going back into the 80s, we can actually see that there was a decline in the late 90s that has resulted in a lower population based on migration counts at the Ghost Shoot migration site. Similarly, at the Bridgers in Montana, where we actually count a much higher volume of eagles, about 10 times the number of birds, we also see a decline. And again, if we've only been counting for the last 15 years or so, we might mistakenly conclude that there hasn't been much going on with eagle populations. They've been fairly stable. But the longer term picture does highlight this concern that we've been highlighting. Migration sites are also places where Hawkwatch is engaged in trapping birds, and we band them to understand where they're going. Banding is has a long history in Europe and North America and elsewhere, and it's a cheap way to understand what birds are doing. At the more expensive end is tracking, and Hawkwatch got involved putting satellite tracking devices on golden eagles. And if you see GOEA, just that's shorthand for golden eagles in the bird world. And we put 33 units out over a 10-year period. It is interesting what we can learn from these birds, but I do want to point out that these were fairly, what I would say, are low resolution or low tech tracking devices. They would only take locations once every 3 days, and the error on the location could be up to 1 kilometer or more. And we had failure rates that were concerning in some of the units too, where they would just stop giving us data. But despite all that, they did reveal, some interesting patterns, as you can see from the map, of these birds moving across the West. A lot of complexity in what's going on, more so than perhaps some other raptors, not really clear pathways that birds are predominantly using. We do see that they wander widely in the summer and are relatively stationary in the winter. And we also find when we have birds go down and the transmitter tells us that a bird has died, what's been going on for these birds as far as threats to them. And I just want to mention here 2 data points where there were 2 electrocutions, and one of those data points in particular in Wyoming basically led to a whole another story on really paying more attention to electrocutions again. Electrocutions were something that the raptor world thought we'd kind of gotten a handle on by the 70s or so. But One of our birds was electrocuted in Wyoming, and when we contacted a game biologist in Wyoming to go retrieve the transmitter for us, they found many other golden eagles electrocuted under adjacent nearby poles, and that really opened the raptor world's eyes to that this is an ongoing problem. And a lot of time and energy and so forth has been invested in the last decade or so looking at retrofitting poles as one solution to help save eagles. Excuse me. Just quickly summarizing on some of the outcomes from the migration studies that Hawkwatch has been involved in. As I was just mentioning, there was a highlighted concern regarding declines in the Western golden eagle population. Electrocutions were brought back on the radar for the conservation of eagles. We've also published a few papers, just highlighting two here. One that came out a few years ago, we looked at the passage of golden eagles at a bunch of existing migration sites and simulated if you were up there doing a survey for only a short amount of time, how close the estimates of golden eagle passage would be to the real passage from the longer term surveys. And that, if that seems a little bit cryptic, the whole point behind that was really to understand what we should recommend for wind developers who want to go survey a ridge, for example, if they want to put up turbines for wind development, because the same places that hawks often migrate have good wind potential for wind energy development. So this really helps them understand what they need to do to understand the raptor volume at a new site that doesn't have long-term monitoring. And another publication just recently came out using migration data, tracking data, and other information to estimate a population of golden eagles in Alaska, which surprisingly may hold over a quarter of the US population of golden eagles. So shifting from migration, while we were starting to detect some of these declines in eagles from migration or suspected declines, we were also beginning to get into nesting surveys in Northwest Utah, hoping that we might be able to pair sites like the Ghost Chutes in Nevada right next door, what we were seeing as far as counts on migration to what was happening in the nesting populations. When I came on board at Hawkwatch in 2006, one of my first jobs was to compile a report on the 10-year history of nesting monitoring that we had done. And we found some concerns for golden eagles in particular related to fire in this landscape. And that really led to a study with the Department of Defense that has a lot of property for military training in Western Utah, and has also concerns about fires related to their own training and safety. And they also have a mission to protect the eagles on their property. And so we've been coordinating and partnering with them since 2010 on a variety of golden eagle research angles, which I'll talk briefly about. And then another angle that won't spend a lot of time on is we worked with the BLM to look at historic nest locations in Utah and central Wyoming in relation to oil and gas drilling to see if spatial buffers that they were applying were effective in protecting those nests. One of the things that we learned from our nest studies, and part of that included compiling historic data on nesting trends for eagles, is that golden eagles, their breeding output varies from year to year with weather conditions and fire and prey cycling and other things. And you can see that here on this graph. There's around a decade or more peaks and troughs in their populations. What concerns us is that there's an overall decline in breeding output for eagles across this long period. And the two pictures here just illustrate kind of two different scenarios, that the feast and famine on the two ends of the ups and downs. On the left, we have two nestlings and a nest full of rabbits. On the right, we have a single nestling with a snake that it doesn't seem overly interested in. When we were getting into our nesting surveys, we recognized the importance of also tracking their most common prey item, the jackrabbit. And so we conducted surveys, and this upper graph shows the jackrabbit trends that we've assessed in Utah since 2011, and we did see that there was a spike in jackrabbits in 2015-16, and below that you can see that compressed period for eagle production also followed that pretty closely. We did see in 2020 that we were also seeing a second upturn in jackrabbits, and unfortunately in summer of 2020 we had something called RHDV2, or rabbit hemorrhagic disease, was introduced into the country or detected in the country. This is a foreign disease that has high mortality for rabbits. And so this last year, the rabbit populations crashed again, presumably from this disease. And it's uncertain what that's going to entail for eagles into the future, but we'll of course keep monitoring that. And just to finish up with the rabbit story here, you know, the graph I was just showing you with a spike in rabbits in 2015 seems interesting, but when we circle it on the right of this graph, and we were able to pull out some historic data from Idaho and Utah on rabbit trends, we can see a similar story as with the golden eagles. Yes, there are regular cycles of ups and downs, but unfortunately, just like with the eagles, the highs are getting lower each year, and we're not seeing as much cycling as we did historically. And that's presumed to be caused by shrub loss. Jackrabbits rely on shrub cover due to fires in the West Desert and cheatgrass, an invasive grass introduced from the Mediterranean that increases fire. So just to quickly summarize on some of the outcomes from our nesting studies, as I was just talking about, we have another number of products with Department of Defense that highlight the kind of the cheatgrass and fire impacts on eagles. During this time, working with a number of partners and highlighting this concern for nesting eagles in Utah, we were able to add the golden eagle to the species of greatest conservation need in the state in 2015. And that's part of their 10-year plan. So it will be on that list for until at least 2025. We've also put out a number of publications and tech notes that talk about our recommendations for how to protect nests in terms of the length of time they need to be protected based on their changes in nest use over the years, and the spatial buffers. And just one other thing I wanted to highlight here quickly is how we collaborate with others. And this is not a study we were directly the lead on, but we contributed genetic samples from Utah. You can see these circles in Utah were all samples that Hawkwatch collected and provided to this study on genetic structure in golden eagles. And other kind of ancillary outcomes from our work on the nesting or nesting studies for golden eagles include on the left a raptor database to compile statewide all the golden eagle locations in the state of Utah. And this is very useful if you're the Bureau of Land Management or the Fish and Wildlife Service, and you're trying to review a proposal for a new wind development or oil and gas development, knowing where these eagle nest locations are to avoid disturbance to them. And we've also been able to use that data from various partners to help the Fish and Wildlife Service develop a model of nesting habitat in areas that aren't surveyed as well as what we have in some parts of Utah, what you can see on the right, and that's for the entire Great Basin across Nevada and other states surrounding it. As we were involved in our nesting studies, similar to the migration studies, the more you delve into trying to track eagles or raptor with a particular technique, tracking with satellite transmitters becomes a very attractive option to get a more in-depth picture of what they're doing. And we did the same thing with our nesting research in Western Utah. And this involves going into these nests like you can see in this background picture and capturing by hand birds shortly before they're about to leave the nest. So they're about as big as they're going to get, so we can put a backpack on them. And these transmitters were, you know, a newer generation and take hourly fixes and provide us with much more accurate, down to a few meters accuracy, and provide a lot of information. Just quickly wanted to share some photos of what this looks like. It's not the easiest approach to studying a species, but definitely requires some specialized skills and equipment to do so. And this is just a short video showing Eric, one of our former biologists. And at the bottom of the frame, in a moment, you can just see the eaglets in the nest at the bottom of the frame. So he's jugging back up from the nest after we put the eaglets back after putting a transmitter. So not every eagle nest is this challenging, but some of them certainly are. And when you get to the nest, you may find yourself face to face with a nestling that does not want to be handled, as in this case with Dustin, another one of our researchers. But when we do get them in hand, we take a bunch of measurements and put them through our processing procedures and fix them with the transmitter and put them back in the nest. And what we get from all this is the interesting spaghetti of bowl of colors you see here. And each color is a different bird that we've tracked at Hawkwatch from 81 different nestling transmitter deployments over a 9-year period. And up to this point, we have just over 500,000 GPS fixes. So the amount of data that we get is really incredible. And the data is rolling in by the hour. We have 18 birds that are online at this point and giving us data. And before I talk about some of the tracking products that we get from that information, I just wanted to share a little side that we are also doing, back to the low-tech side. We've been putting color bands on golden eagles in the last 4 or 5 years now, like you can see on this bird. And I just bring that up here. I presume if you're on this call, you have an interest in birds. And if you're out there doing any birding or photography and you see a bird, a golden eagle with a blue metal band, we encourage you to take a close look and see if you can record it and we can get resighting information on these birds. Here's an example. Also from more and more hunters and other game agencies are putting remote trail cameras at water features or on places they're hoping are on gut piles and other things. And we get resightings like this here of a golden eagle with you can see its blue band on the leg as it flies off. Returning back to the more intensive data though from the tracking devices, this is another one of the products that we've been able to achieve. And this is from a publication that was just accepted to Wildlife Biology. And there's a whole lot going on in the publication, but this is just one map showing how we can model areas where golden eagles in western Utah and eastern Nevada are summering in yellow, wintering in blue, or using for both times of year in green. And then the areas in gray are areas that eagles really aren't spending much time. So those are areas that are relatively, for example, the military was again involved in this research, and their boundaries are shown there in the center. They don't have a lot of golden eagle summer or winter habitat. Another interesting finding we found, or that came out of this, is that in the summer, our golden eagles are generally found further from roads, but in winter, they're found significantly closer to both roads and power lines. If, again, you've been out doing any birding in the winter looking for eagles, this isn't probably surprising to you. They do, again, they're not territorial in the winter, and so they'll concentrate along roads. I mentioned early on that golden eagles rely on jackrabbits. That's a live prey item they rely on. In the winter, they do make a lot of use of carrion or dead things to supplement their diet. And again, I just wanted to highlight one of the outputs from kind of the power of partnerships. And this is an example where we have provided some of our transmitter data to a larger analysis of all the golden eagle tracking data that the Fish and Wildlife Service was able to get their hands on from 571 different birds to look at the patterns of golden eagle movement in North America. And this really informed the scale at which they manage golden eagles. moving from kind of an eco-region approach, which was a finer kind of scale, to looking at them in the flyways based on just the intermovements that we see from these eagles, the wide-ranging movements. Just out of, if you're curious at all, Hawkwatch HWI tagged 13% of the birds in this data set. And there's another paper coming out that was just accepted from many of these same birds, looking at the survivorship and the different mortality factors that these eagles encountered. Rather than talking about that specific paper, though, I'm going to show some of the data from our specific Hawkwatch birds. It tells a very similar story to the larger collection of birds. And what this table shows is the birds that we've recovered after they've died, and their presumed cause of mortality. Because it takes us sometimes a few days to find these birds, and if they die in the summer when it's hot, we do have a large proportion that we just can't really say with any certainty what the cause of death was. But of those that we can, the red highlighted text are human-caused mortality. So collision injury by a car, poisoning, including lead poisoning, being shot, a drowning in a stock tank, and electrocution. And so if we just look at the known, if we ignore the unknown sources and look at the percentage of human-caused mortality, it's about 37% of all the known mortality from these tracked birds. So that's unfortunate, and that's still a large piece of the loss that we're experiencing for golden eagles. One other thing I wanted to mention too is that our first year survivorship for golden eagles from 81 birds that we've tracked is about 52%, and it varies from year to year with the jackrabbit cycle. This is quite a bit lower than that I mentioned in the last slide, that there's a new publication from hundreds of golden eagles suggesting that first year survival is 70%. So that also gives us concern that here in Utah, our survivorship is quite a bit lower, likely due to the habitat change with fire and cheatgrass that we see in the Great Basin. I will also just highlight here, while we're on this slide, that we had 4 mortalities from car collisions, and that is really going to be a piece of the story coming up shortly. And when we found birds on the roadside where they've been struck from our transmitters, that highlighted some areas where we wanted to do additional research. And specifically, sorry, let me just pause a second here. I have something right in the middle of my screen blocking my view of what I'm trying to highlight. Specifically, that led us to our winter road studies of golden eagles. And you can see some unfortunate photos here, birds reacting when they come to these roadsides to feed on big game like deer and other things. Just to set the stage a little bit, golden eagles, again, in the wintertime, their live prey is less available. For thousands of years, if not more, golden eagles have been feeding on dead animals in the winter. Or deer, mule deer, and other big game, winter's a tough time of year, so we have a lot of overwinter mortality of big game. So eagles have responded to that with humans in the landscape now, and cars and infrastructure. A lot of the overwinter mortality is now occurring concentrated on roadways, and eagles have responded to that, and they get struck secondarily when they are feeding on that roadkill. We have a 5-year study that we've been looking at this issue in Oregon, Utah, and Wyoming. And I'm not going to go into depth on it. We do have another recorded presentation that was given previously by Jessica Taylor on our Eagle Vehicle Strike project. But just want to summarize really quickly some of the interesting takeaways. In the first phase of the study for 3 years, We deployed 185 cameras, like what you see in the upper right, to see how eagles interact with carcasses and when cars go by. And that really afforded us a wealth of information. Over 90,000 photos, 3,000 interactions with vehicles, and unfortunately, a fairly high number of golden eagles found struck, and confirming that this is a major problem for them. But the takeaway really from this graph in the lower left is that as a deer or other carcass is further from the road, the use by eagles in green increases, and the likelihood that they're going to flush from a car decreases. Fairly intuitive information there, but really important from within the scientific and management worlds to be able to have hard data on how far to move a carcass to make it more useful and safe for eagles. And that's, we conclude, is approximately 12 meters. And we have a new publication that we're about to submit on this exact finding. In the second phase of the research, we focused on Western Wyoming and looked at a before and after treatment versus control study design. So in the phase one, we were really just observing the problem by collecting data. Once we had understood the problem more in depth from phase one, in phase two, we actually moved into this manipulation phase where we moved roadkill to what we considered the eagle safe distances, and then studied the response to really prove that it's effective in increasing eagle use. I just have a few other numbers here on kind of the wealth of data we get, the eagle sightings, and unfortunately 55 additional dead eagles, 48 of those being golden eagles, and an amazing 4.22 million photos that we are nearly 2/3 through reviewing at this point. The summary of what we really want to achieve with this project, I think, is best just shown with a few photos. So this is what the situation often is: an eagle with a large vehicle that's potentially going to flush it, or a situation where we actually do have flushing while they're feeding on a deer. And this is what we want to fix by moving roadkill up into the shrubs away from the road, and we get what I call, an eagle party. Many eagles hanging out happily, hours feeding with no flushing, unless they're flushing from each other, but no real vehicle risk when they're in this type of situation. So with that, I just wanted to bring us into where we are now. The research that I've quickly gone over has helped to inform ourselves, partners, has contributed to what we call meta-analyses of different data sets to get a better understanding of how eagle populations are doing, what threats they face, what mortality is like for different age classes. And one of the really powerful products that came out of that was from the Fish and Wildlife Service in 2016, a demographic report that basically calculated a population size and annual mortality for golden eagles. And so if you look at this graph on the right side, you'll see the 79,900. That's the current estimate for North America's golden eagle population. That's not a whole lot of birds for all of North America. It's a small town in the US. And other species that get a lot of attention, like the greater sage grouse, 150,000 birds is the estimate for that population. Bald eagles are currently at 330,000 and climbing. They've done really well since recovery, and just a few other species showing in the millions. So the output from a lot of this data collected over the last couple of decades does confirm to us that low population numbers are a concern. And more concerning to me is that they also found that the carrying capacity in the US is at 55% of what it could be. So we could support many more eagles than we are. And the annual loss of eagles that we're experiencing, about 2,000, or what would be sustainable to keep population stable, is currently exceeded by human-caused mortality. And so human-caused mortality, things like electrocution and vehicle strikes, are a huge issue that we need to get a handle on. And because of some of this information and the long-standing concern and protections from the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, where we find ourselves today in terms of the framework for protection is we have something, in 2009, there was an Eagle permit rule or the Eagle rule. In 2016, a revision or update to that. And both of those contain this idea of no net loss for golden eagles. It's recognized that there's concern over their low population numbers and the high human mortality. And so if you, for example, are a wind developer and want to build a wind facility that is in eagle habitat, you are encouraged strongly to assess what your risk is for eagles. And then if you want a permit to cover you in case you do have eagle deaths at your site, you need to show how you're going to offset those eagles somewhere else, how you're going to save eagles to offset those that might be taken at your site. And it's, just want to comment back on, as I was talking about the eagle road studies that we've been doing for 5 years. That's been entirely funded for the first phase through wind industry and supporters like NextEra, one of our sponsors, and other wind companies, UAMPS, that had an interest in understanding how they might offset for permits that they're interested in having for their sites. As I mentioned early on, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act incidental take enforcement has been restored, and the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act was not challenged, and so there really was no change in the last administration with protections for eagles themselves related to BGEPA. I also just wanted to mention a number of the outreach and publicity elements we have going on related to our research. We recently had an article in the Deseret News that was picked up by the Associated Press on the issue with rabbit hemorrhagic disease and just the poor nesting that's been ongoing in the West Desert in a partnership with DoD. We've at different times have had videos made about our research and just a couple other publications and reports highlighting the issues with golden eagles. I wanted to finish up with one last study, and I include this in the where we are now section because this is our most recent angle with golden eagles, basically looking at nestling health. So we initially focused a lot on tracking populations and then tracking free-flying birds, but now we're taking it down to the fine scale to really say what's happening in the nest in this long period from the time an egg hatches before they leave the nest, which could be months, to affect whether a bird survives or not, and whether they survive after they leave the nest. There seems to be a fair bit of variability in nests in similar habitat and whether the nestlings survive or not. So this is an area where Dustin Maloney, a staff at Hawkwatch and student at Utah State with Department of Defense funding again, is taking a deeper dive into nest health. And he has completed 2 of 3 intensive field seasons. So I won't give much of an update here other than to say that it's starting to shed some light on things like lead, elevated lead and elevated mercury in some of these nestlings that are, for example, close to the Great Salt Lake with the mercury, or close to human golf courses or habitations for the lead. And we think that's related to shooting varmints, as they're so called, like rabbits and ground squirrels and other things that the eagles are then feeding on. As part of his research, he's taking blood samples from the nestlings at different times when he goes into the nest and putting cameras in the nest to see what they're eating, to see how diet affects them, as well as using our transmitters to see what the survivorship looks like for these birds based on their health characteristics. And just, a quick summary of what that is really, we're trying to look at how the location of the eagles, whether they're in remote settings versus closer to humans, if they're in poor habitat or relatively healthy shrub habitats, what their food and diet is, and how all that relates to the disease, whether they have contaminants, parasites, and so on. And just quickly showing a few photos to the wealth of data we're getting from this effort with the cameras and nests. This is a few-day-old nestling, and then about a month plus later, being fed a great blue heron here, and another nest with a snake. And this is a bird from Antelope Island that had avian pox, and often researchers, others may bring this into a bet. It's generally thought that this bird wouldn't have high survivorship, but we did put a transmitter on it and put it back in its nest, and it's actually now been on air for 2 years and seems to be doing quite well out there. But again, understanding how this type of disease and other things occur in closer to humans versus in more remote settings is part of this research. And part of what we're doing also with in recent years and with Dustin's work and just a natural progression of our eagle work is to look more at what we call urban eagles, or eagles in our background and in our backyards. And we do have a number of territories that still remain in our kind of urban interface. And this video here just shows one. You can see the nestling here on this high perched nest, and we'll pull out and you'll get a sense of those nests that we still have being used in our Wasatch Mountains and surrounding areas are generally pretty difficult to access, somewhat sheltered from human disturbance, even though we have a lot of recreation, a lot of people right nearby, and as you'll see as we pan out to the Salt Lake Valley. All right, so just to wrap up so we can have a little bit of time for questions. A lot of different directions that we're going to continue to go with this work. Clearly between the road study, millions of photos there of eagles using carcasses, and now the nesting study with from egg to fledging, we have tons of photos that we're going to mine to understand behavior and diet and other things. I'm also excited that we've been working with the Division of Wildlife to look at vacant eagle territories that we might consider for shrub restoration. That's a long-term effort. We may be talking about 30 or 40 years, but I'm excited that that's an angle we're considering to restore some of these areas that have been burnt out or otherwise degraded. We're also working with the BLM to look at some new study angles, including eagles and sage grouse and recreation. And very recently, we're involved with the Fish and Wildlife Service to actually apply some additional roadkill relocation in central Utah to reduce mortality in some of our hotspot areas. And with that, I will just finish by saying, there's a number of ways you can obviously help eagles. I think those of us interested in raptors are generally outdoorsy people. And so when we're out, if we're climbers, for example, we have brochures on how to avoid disturbance when you're climbing and be aware of raptors. If you're a photographer, respecting their space. If you hear a raptor calling or see them flush, you're too close. And so let's be respectful of their space. We all have a role in protecting these habitats from fire and invasives, and so far it's easier than you think to park your vehicle when you're out recreating and start a shrub fire, or people who are recreational shooting. And so helping to keep the intact remaining habitats protected from fire is a high priority for us. We've seen elevated lead in a number of our eagles, and other partners who are doing research have also seen lead as a major problem for golden eagles and other raptors. And so we want to make sure we're not contaminating their food by leaving, if you're a hunter, clean up your gut piles, consider non-lead ammunition and other contaminants that we might put in the environment. And importantly, we have to stand up for bird and raptor protections. It would be great if we all just appreciated raptors for the sake of raptors, but we do require regulations to police behaviors. And so when there's attacks on those protections, it's important that we have a strong voice to keep those in place. And of course, you can also help golden eagles by continuing to support our work. Hopefully this whirlwind and all the different research we've done on golden eagles. Highlights all the different ways we've been trying to understand what's going on with golden eagles and inform conservation, and how your support will help us continue to do that work. So that's it. Appreciate it.
Fantastic. Well, I can't believe how much we covered in 50 or so minutes, Steve. Thank you for doing that. Just a quick reminder that if you have questions, we'll take as many as we can. So we're going to get started with one about the vehicle strikes. So Steve, the question is, how are the departments of transportation in Utah and Wyoming responding to the data regarding moving large game carcasses?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we are just at the point, as I mentioned, where we're submitting a publication on the distance that we want to move things, and we are moving to our first stage with in Utah of actually doing those relocations ourselves and coordinating with DOT of what that's going to look like. So it's a little bit early to say exactly how that's going to be received. I will say that, throughout the study, we've coordinated with Department of Transportation in both states, and we've had the permits we need to work in the right of way. And so I think in general, I'm not expecting there to be a roadblock, and I'm expecting there's going to be good reception. A big part of what we're trying to do this coming winter in our implementation in central Utah is to document how we can do it efficiently, and that it's not much more work than their standard management of roadkill, and provide those tools to them and kind of guidance, and when we bring it to them.
Great. What about the fires that we're experiencing in the West, Steve? Are we seeing fires impact golden eagle nesting?
Yes, for sure. And again, I didn't have time to dive deep into all the different little research projects, but part of our DoD output and research, we have a report where we basically looked at territories that had experienced fire within their perimeters and those that hadn't, and showed that the nest occupancy and the number of young produced over the years was much higher in the unburned, or the fewer burns, territories. And so very direct relationship of fire to breeding activity in the West Desert. And again, we think that's the primary cause for the jackrabbit declines. We think we've mapped fire perimeters from the BLM over the years, and which years they occurred, and looked at the breeding activity. And we can see when there were a high number of fires back in 2007, we had this decline corresponding the following year in breeding output. So definitely a big concern for their breeding. And there was even a story on the west side of Utah Lake where a territory, an active nest was actually burned, and a nestling was found by a bander, had survived the fire, but was completely, all of its feathers were burned off, and was able to be rehabbed, aptly named Phoenix, and was released.
That is a very appropriate name for that bird, and a pretty phenomenal recovery story too. Kind of related to that, Steve, what about the question that I feel like we get so much, which is about climate change. So beyond increasing fires, how is climate change impacting golden eagle populations?
Right, and yeah, it is. It's hard to talk about it without talking about the fire aspect, because I think that is the biggest piece for golden eagles, just because they are an open country, the sagebrush and the shrub habitats, and the story so much of the Great Basin is cheatgrass and how that's driven fire. And cheatgrass is this Mediterranean grass. I won't go too far into it, but it's a winter annual, so it grows really early compared to our grasses, and it's already dried out, and so it's ready to burn pretty early in the summer. And so that's really increased our fire frequency. And that was considered to be somewhat elevational, limited in some areas, that some habitats at above 7,000 feet, for example, that maybe were protected from cheatgrass spreading into it. But as we're warming, cheatgrass is moving higher up. And so the climate change is a driver for the shrub loss and the fire cycle and the other things, and the extended droughts and all those things that are playing into it as well.
Great. Yeah, I know we get that question all the time, so I'm glad that somebody brought that up tonight. You mentioned during the presentation that, and you've said it a couple times in the Q&A now, that the jackrabbit population is so critical to golden eagle success, Steve. Someone's asking if there are initiatives in progress or, being thought of to improve jackrabbit populations.
Right. Well, right now it's really complicated by this whole rabbit hemorrhagic disease that's just been introduced. We don't really know what that's going to do. So we're kind of on a wait and see. We're really glad we have this statewide partnership where we're tracking with transects across the state to know what the populations are. We're hoping it'll be kind of like a 1 year major dip as that disease spread through the population, and the animals that survived it will be, will be more immunity in the rabbit populations, and we'll start to see an upturn. That said, I don't think there's really a whole lot we can do as far as like, captive or supplementing breeding for jackrabbits. It's more of the habitat that we want to look at, and protecting habitat and the shrub restorations that we've been talking about. So that's, two things that are on our radar. And again, partnering with Fish and Wildlife Service or talking with them is, let's identify the really good habitat where there's eagles currently and make sure we don't have problems there. So they don't end up in the same condition as our burned out areas. So let's make those highly productive special territories like off limits, and we know where they are, and BLM knows where they are. So if there's fires, they're right on top of those. And then let's work on restoration for shrubs in the areas where we've recently had eagles, but now it's just kind of, we've lost too many shrubs, but we might be able to bring those back. And so to me, that's where we focus to bring the jackrabbits back, is those targeted restorations of shrub.
Great. Well, it'll be exciting to see what progress is made on that habitat restoration over, the next several decades, like you mentioned. I'm going to do one last call for questions. We have one last one that I'm going to ask, unless we see a couple more come in before we hit the top of the hour. You mentioned a sage grouse study. Can you say a little bit more about that and what you're really trying to dig into there with eagles?
Sure. So, and I also had the graph that showed populations, and I chose sage grouse there partly because there has been so much interest in the West with sage grouse, because they are also an indicator species, just like, Hawkwatch focuses on raptors. Sage grouse are sagebrush specialists, and so they really indicate what's going on out there. And a lot of people wanted to look at kind of overlay of golden eagles, open country sagebrush species with sage grouse. But, as sage grouse have been of concern, there's also been concern about how golden eagles interact with them. They are a sage grouse predator. As we have degraded habitats, as we lose our jackrabbits, eagles are going to put more pressure on sage grouse. So it's really looking at an area in the state where there's been some concern about power lines near Lex and how eagles are on that and interacting with the sage grouse. And how we might understand the impacts for the sage grouse and what those mean. And I really believe it comes back to, I think what all wildlife biologists are taught in whatever Fish and Wildlife 101 is that if you've got good habitat, predation doesn't really matter. They'll be able to outproduce the predators. I think it's more of an indicator once we start to focus on these things that there's some concerns about the habitat and the widespread population declines for sage grouse. So, yeah.
Okay, I had one last question that snuck in, and it's pretty good. So we'll ask it, and then we'll close out the night, Steve. How much of a problem are wind farms for eagles?
Yeah, what a good one to finish on. That I could talk for 30 minutes about that, but no, I won't. Yeah, it's a tough one. We have been fortunate to work with a number of wind companies that have been very, I would say, progressive in how they want to deal with the issue when they're trying to site a wind farm, or when they have a problem that's brought to them that they may have an eagle issue on their property, and trying to address that. Everything from doing shutdowns of the turbines with using our observers when we see eagles on site, to putting out transmitters, to researching, the use of the site and so on. So I think there's a lot of wind companies that are working very hard on trying to understand it and working with Fish and Wildlife Service and very cooperative about when they do have mortality, so we can understand what factors contributed to it better. And a number of them have funded things like the roadkill study to try to offset. So, but as far as like the total number of, the impact of the wind farms itself, there's a few different studies that come out and estimate the impacts. It's in the hundreds of golden eagles per year. The total collision estimate of all types of vehicles, wind farms, power lines is right now estimated to be around 500 and some golden eagles per year. It's behind shooting. It's right around. So there's other threats that are also concerned. So, I'm not trying to waffle on that at all. But one thing I will say about it is like I also want to think about it from the perspective of when I started at Hawkwatch, we were focusing on oil and gas development and buffers. There's no direct visceral impact of oil and gas other than when we talk about climate change and all those things. Like you don't have eagles dying at a drilling site for an oil and gas farm typically, but you do for wind farms. And so it's really hard to compare energy development as far as eagle impacts. It's so hard to really get a handle on what the combined oil and gas development across the West looks like versus the annual mortalities from golden eagles at wind farms. I will say that the oil and gas industry has really had has not really had much of a requirement for what they needed to do to help eagles, despite when they were encroaching on habitat. There were some spatial buffers, but outside of the nesting season, they could drill, they could do these things. There was a lot of habitat change when you drill in entire areas like in the Price or central Wyoming, versus the wind industry as pretty much from other than Altamont in Western or in California, all the sites from the last decade or so have all been saddled with pre-construction surveys and offsets and trying to deal with it. And so anyways, I don't know if that all comes across. Happy to follow up on that question, but I get asked that one quite regularly, and it's a complicated, it's hard to compare directly, say, oil and gas development to wind development and the way they impact both, our air and birds and our future and everything else.
Yeah, and if you're interested, I did place a link in the chat. We had a talk that one of our international raptor biologists, Meg Murtrade, gave on how we're working on combating wind turbine and raptor collisions in South Africa. So if that's something you're interested in, hope you'll check that out to get a little bit of that perspective too. Well, Steve, thank you again for your time, and to everyone who tuned in, thank you so much for joining us. Just as a reminder, this is our last 35 years and counting event until our gala next week. It's Wednesday, November 3rd at 6 p.m. Mountain, and we're debuting a brand new film with really a great look at all of our migration sites. So if you've never been able to visit one, hope you'll join us. You can visit hawkwatch.org/35 years to purchase your ticket to join us. And we also have a great silent auction. So thank you again, Steve. Thank you all for joining us. And thanks for being a part of raptor conservation.